All right, so next up is Joel Yee from Georgia Institute of Technology talking about representation learning for neural population activity with neural data transformers. So go for it, Joel.
Thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, so I'll be talking about my work with neural data transformers. I apologize if some of the terms are overloaded from the previous presentations. They may have slightly different meanings here. So I'll start by talking about how recurrent neural networks, like the LFADS model we heard about earlier, can model neural population states sequentially, and a little more on what that means. And then I'll discuss how sequential modeling can be a problem and how this transformer architecture we're introducing enables parallel modeling. And finally, we'll show that this neural data transformer NDT architecture we're introducing matches recurrent neural networks in modeling autonomous systems and offline analyses. Okay, great. So we've seen that neural activity predicts behavior, which is great, but unfortunately, it's noisy. So if we're trying to train behavioral decoders on top of these, they won't perform very well. Fortunately for us, neural activity reflects an underlying state, which is more stable. We hope that we can train better behavioral decoders on this state, and we can approximately represent this state by referring to the firing rates of the individual neurons instead of the spiking activity itself. This state is consistent across trials of the same behavior, which will be important for if we want to decode behavior. And now we ask, how can we model this state? So we consider a deep learning approach to this problem, where we're feeding in the raw neural activity and we're asking the deep neural network to predict firing rates. Specifically, our input spiking activity is first binned off into T time steps, and these time steps correspond to the initial population representations that can be fed into our deep neural network. The deep neural network processes these features and finally maps them into firing rates. And again, these rates are a view of our neural population state, and they can be useful for predicting behavior. So the state of the art for this problem in offline analysis is LFADS, as introduced earlier. And LFADS trains a deep neural network to reconstruct neural activity, as like discussed. But the problem is that LFADS can be slow, and that can be bad for real-time applications. And to understand why it can be slow, we'll need to break it open a little bit. So LFADS is a sequential encoder-decoder architecture. So inside our deep neural network black box, we have an encoder, which is responsible for summarizing the input spiking activity into a single code. And then a decoder is responsible for extracting each time step's rate predictions from that code. And more specifically, this decoder is a recurrent neural network. And recurrent neural networks operate by sequentially updating an internal state. So the decoder takes what the encoder has outputted, and it will use that to initialize its state. And then using learned rules, it will update its internals T times, and then it will output T firing rate predictions. And this is well motivated by the dynamical systems view of neural populations, which posits that neural population states themselves evolve as a state that evolves over time according to a fixed set of rules. So in online decoding, our models will receive windows of recent activity. So for example, let's say we receive 30 milliseconds, 3 bins of 10 milliseconds each. And to minimize latency, we'll be asking the model to predict firing rates on overlapping windows. So in the next 10 milliseconds, we'll feed in another 30 millisecond snippet, but our decoder will need to iterate through all 3 of those bins, even though it's only interested in the last bin's new firing rate predictions. And so this is our slow bottleneck. And RNNs could theoretically be trained to work around this issue. We asked instead, what if we could find representations without any sequential processing? What if we could transform our representations to find our firing rate predictions in parallel? And this is exactly what the neural data transformer is doing. The neural data transformer essentially has these transformer blocks stacked on top of each other for L layers. And inside each of these transformer blocks, our fed-in features are extracting the information it needs from every other feature. And it learns how to do this through something called a self-attention mechanism, but the details of which I won't go into here. So in contrast with a recurrent neural network, which is learning how to update a system that corresponds to our neural population activity, then transformer is an entirely statistical approach to this instead, which just learns the different input dependencies between different firing rate, spiking activity inputs. And because we have parallel processing now, this neural data transformer can predict rates in 4 milliseconds. And this is independent of our input bin length. This could enable a much smoother real-time application because on a typical sequence length that we would feed in during real-time application, like 50 bins, LFADS takes upwards of 20 milliseconds. And we care about transformers for more than just this speedup, because transformers have outpaced recurrent neural networks in modeling representations in both natural language processing and vision domains. So on the right-hand side, you can see that a transformer can split up different patches of an image, feed them into the same type of architecture we just discussed, and train the output representations to do object detection or classification. And similarly, in natural language processing, we can learn representations of words that can be fed into a spam classifier. But we face two potential challenges when transferring or translating to the neural domain. Specifically, dynamical systems, the theory that we mentioned, matches recurrent neural networks much better, right? And secondly, neural data sets are much smaller. We're looking at megabytes of data instead of gigabytes. So we verified this first problem directly by assessing whether the neural data transformer can model autonomous dynamical systems. We do this by making synthetic data sets, the Lorenz system and the chaotic RNN system discussed in the LFADS paper. We can see how the Lorenz system is built out in this series of figures. We have 3 dimensions of variation forming the butterfly figure in the Lorenz equations. And these 3 variables can be projected upwards from figure B to figure C into a firing rate matrix of neurons against time. And then this firing rate matrix can simply be sampled according to, for example, a Poisson distribution to make our actual synthetic spiking activity. Now that we have these ground truth rates, we can compare our actual model's predictions against this ground truth. And this is something we can only do in synthetic systems. But we see that in this case, our neural data transformer does make predictions that are very closely aligned with the ground truth firing rates. And this is quantified by the R² between the ground truth and the neural data transformer, which we average across channels and times of neurons. We see that the neural data transformer recovers rates that are essentially as good as the LFADS model in both these data sets. Similarly, we can model neural activity recorded from the macaque M1. And this data was recorded during reaching task, where the monkey reached one of 108 different kinematic trajectories. And the plots on the right are color-coded by the different reaching trajectories. So we see on different trials of the same reaching condition, we are recovering qualitatively similar rates for a given neuron's activity. And again, as mentioned previously, when we don't have ground truth rates, we can use behavior to evaluate our model quality. So we do least squares regression to predict the monkey's arms kinematics that were simultaneously recorded. And we see that when we do this, we can report the R² again between the predicted and ground truth velocities for this data set. And here, the neural data transformer and the LFADS do, again, roughly on par and do very well. Whereas the smoothing baseline that we present is, which would be analogous to trying to build a decoder on top of the raw neural activity, only gets 0.6 R². And we verified the second challenge, that the neural data transformer can scale to smaller data sets, which may be of more interest in other neural domains. Our data set has 2,300 trials, which is fairly large. So we restrict to smaller subsets. And we see that when we train our representations using only 90 training trials, our neural data transformer and LFADS do outperform the smoothing baseline still. So in summary, we've introduced the neural data transformer, which is a transformer for neural population activity. And offline, this transformer models autonomous dynamical systems and aligned M1 activity as well as a recurrent neural network, and it runs 5 times faster. So currently it does lag on small and non-autonomous data sets, but it still improves on smoothing. And so we've introduced a drop-in alternative for LFADS, which is independent of any dynamical systems theory. And we're hoping that this can provide a different lens for neural computation and could scale to different brain areas or scale to better performances with more data. Thank you.
All right, thank you for your great talk, Joel. We really appreciate it. I'm looking for some questions, so feel free to submit those in the Q&A, and I'm also monitoring the chat box for that.
Mm-hmm. We have some additional results that maybe would be not prudent to go through if there's only a minute, but we could maybe talk about it if there are no questions.
Yeah, definitely. We have a question here, but let's keep that on the back burner because it could be fun to see some additional results. So Cole Hurwitz is wondering, on the second to last slide, it seems as though the LFADs still outperform NDT. Given that the transformers outperform recurrent neural nets in NLP, do you have any intuition why this could be the case?
Mm-hmm. I am fairly confident that this is just because transformers are typically trained on much larger data sets. And so typically it's already a challenge to get it working on a data set of 2,300 trials. We expect that, for example, if we increase the number of trials, the transformers could potentially even overtake LFADS, but in the domain that, or the data ranges that we care about, we do expect to see some lag because the recurrent neural network is just much more suited for the type of data we're working for.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And we have another one. So from Mustafa Abku, I'm sorry if I've mispronounced anything there. Is this a trial-based model like LFADS? And if so, is it feasible to use this in a real-time application?
There are still many things to prove out before it could be used for real-time application. But yes, this is also a trial-based method. So it can directly be used anywhere LFADS is used.
Good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. So if you feel like a burning desire to show some of the additional results, we do have a little bit of time. Okay. Yeah. So now I'll say, everybody, you should feel free to address any questions to any of the panelists right now. I'm going to hang on for a little bit longer. Technically, we're at the end of the session, but we do have a few minutes before we'll be kicked out. So I'll just hang out here and see if there are any further questions. All right, so already we have Chad Boulay is curious, has a question for Joel. He said he never really tried to learn about transformers because they didn't seem to have applications in his domain. But this seems to change that for them. Do you have any tutorials or codes for understanding transformers in this context that you'd like to share?
So yes, it hasn't been applied to this domain before. So I think this is the first work to show that. I would say that the existing transformers resources are quite good for understanding it in a general sense. There are a lot of resources for understanding in natural language processing. There aren't any resources for understanding it in the neural domain. We're hoping that this can be extended into a full work, but that should still take at least a few months more time. So I would suggest if you feel a burning desire, you should go ahead and check out those other resources.
So this publication will be that resource that he's asking for. Excellent.
Hopefully.